And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to episode number 244 of the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Thursday afternoon with me here in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. We have another fairly important, at least for Gen Xers and young boomers, movie anniversary. Today is the 33rd birthday of Catherine Bigelow's pretty fucking spectacular action thriller, Point Break. Now, under different circumstances, this was a movie that could have easily been swallowed up during a very stacked summer season. And to give you an idea, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, which runaway, insane box office hit, was released 1 week prior. Naked Gun 2.5, which was also a substantial hit, was released, I believe, 2 weeks prior. And then you had Kevin Costner's Robin Hood, Men of Thieves. Yeah, I get mixed up. Robin Hood, Men in Tights, the Mel Brooks film from a couple of years later. But Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, although it's kind of slow, as one critic put it, the first half is longer than the Crusades. But then it kind of gets into high gear. But Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves was a significant box office hit. And then you had the film Pure Luck with Danny DeVito and Martin Short. A lot of people really like that. Bruce Willis's Hudson Hawk bombed, but that's a film that has somewhat been reappraised over the years. It was so quirky and different and unusual and ridiculous that a lot of people just were expecting a different kind of movie. And as Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce's buddy, found out 2 years later with Last Action Hero, audience expectation is very important. And if the audience thinks they're getting an action film and then they get Hudson Hawk, many cases they're going to reject it if they see it. And if they hear, yeah, this isn't really an action film, they're just not going to go. At Point Break, even though it was released the week after Terminator 2, did really good box office, ended up grossing over $80 million worldwide, and the budget was around 25. So the old, it's not an old adage, but the old concept and the idea of what constitutes a box office hit. If a film grosses 3 times or more than its production cost, that's generally speaking, it's always been the barometer. Now, I shouldn't say always. In the days of the studio system, it probably wasn't. But since you had studios operating independently of one another and people being able to make decisions outside of the studio system, that's usually how it goes. Point Break, although it was an action film and there were other action movies, as I've said, that were released in the same, around the same time frame. V.I. Warshawski with Kathleen Turner technically is an action thriller. Like, there were a lot of movies, at least in the same realm. But Point Break, the preview, it came across differently in the preview. It seemed much more up-tempo, much more realistic than even a Terminator 2 or a Robin Hood. And it has to be said, because Keanu Reeves, although technically the star, that's not why people went to the theaters. It wasn't Keanu Reeves that got fannies in seats. It was the strength of the trailer and the fact that Patrick Swayze was at his peak. He was at the high water mark, and he would never be as big a star again as he was, as this film prepared to be, unleashed upon the American public first. But it's important to understand that Swayze, unlike almost every other big star that is not, the Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Bruce Willis, but in the other realm of stars, to have had 2 massively iconic roles in Ghost, but first, Dirty Dancing, where it's not just that the films are so well remembered, or he was, sexiest man alive, heartthrob, whatever, but that he had lines of dialogue in both movies that are remembered. And his performances in both movies, entirely different, are remembered so fondly, and were, even at the time, going back to the days of Point Break. Nobody Puts Baby in the Corner, Dirty Dancing, and ditto, Ghost. I Love You, ditto. And Patrick Swayze on a DVD for Ghost he kind of joked about it, but he kind of wasn't joking about it, where he said, you have no idea how many women come up to me, even now, even if I'm with my wife, and want me to say the word ditto to them. And he also talked about, I can't go more than a couple of hours of a day, not even a day. I can't go more than a couple of hours on any day without somebody asking me to say the line, nobody puts baby in the corner. So Patrick Swayze, early in 1991, as Ghost had already gone berserk and people that were still swooning over Johnny in Dirty Dancing, Patrick Swayze hosted Saturday Night Live. And it is a memorable show because it is almost a touchstone moment, even though it wasn't from a broader perspective, but it feels like it. Because Mariah Carey was the musical guest, and Mariah was, to say that she was on the rise, she was on the rise with a machine gun, like with an Uzi. She was rising so fast. And Swayze was at his peak. And the thing with Saturday Night Live, it's often had its finger, going back to the 70s, on the pulse of pop culture and Americana. That was more or less a happy accident. But Swayze still had the long hair, and, you know, I don't know if he was quite finished shooting Point Break. That I don't know, but he still had the hair and a kind of blonde. And he was a picture of health. And it's generally regarded to be one of the better shows with that kind of host and that kind of musical guest. And in that episode, Patrick Swayze does a Chippendales bit with the late, great Chris Farley. And that is, many consider that to be like a top 5 greatest skit in the history of Saturday Night Live. And a big part of it is because Chris Farley was so light on his feet. Nobody knew that Farley could do what he did there, which was dance not as well as Patrick Swayze, but that he was not falling over his feet. He was light on his feet. And if you want to go back, somebody like me can mention an actor named Fatty Arbuckle. And Fatty Arbuckle was somebody who was very overweight like Chris Farley, but also he seemed like a tap dancer. And so there was so much that went into people's excitement for Point Break, even if they wanted to see Terminator 2 a second and third time, or they wanted to see The Naked Gun 2.5 again, or Hot Shots with Charlie Sheen, which was another like a Top Gun spoof. That was a big hit in the summer of 1991. But Point Break hit, and the reviews were pretty good, and Roger Ebert loved it. And as I've talked about, Ebert to me is the best film critic who ever lived, because he was an intellectual, a probable genius, but he never condescended to his readers or his viewers on television. And his buddy, his partner, his arguing buddy for life, Gene Siskel, was another man who was fiercely intelligent, but resisted the urge to talk down to his viewers on the television show and his readers, in the case of Gene, Chicago Tribune, and Roger, Chicago Sun-Times. And it is something that neither John Simon, who was a fantastic critic in his own right, and Pauline Kael, they couldn't resist, always showing off how fucking smart they were by throwing all sorts of 30-letter words at the reader when they could have just been like Roger Ebert, who knew how intelligent he was, but wanted to actually connect with the readers or the viewers on television. And Roger Ebert, the way that he phrased it, he gave Point Break 3.5 stars out of the old 4-star system, not 3.5 out of 5. Most critics, I think, use 5 stars today, and there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with best out of 10. And of course, on the TV show, Siskel and Ebert either did that or that. And there were movies that Roger gave 2.5 stars, thumbs up. And then there were movies he gave 2.5 stars, thumbs down. But Point Break, the way that he described it, and this is classic Roger Ebert, in the review, he said, summer movie watchers are unlikely to find a more entertaining thrill ride this summer. And that is so perfectly descriptive of Point Break. It is not a high-minded sci-fi actioner like Terminator 2, which has larger points to make about humanity and robotics and AI. It is not even Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, dastardly villains, and Kevin Costner having a California accent, which doesn't really make any sense. But Point Break exists to entertain, and the stunt work is off the charts, and you have a fantastic star in Patrick Swayze, playing a villain who is not really as villainous as he could be. He is a villain who kind of has a point. He kind of is making sense. And as a younger person, I wasn't into, when I first saw the movie, in other words, 17. But when I first saw Point Break, I was only looking at the fact that, spoiler alert, Patrick Swayze is part of a gang of surfers who rob banks while wearing masks of former presidents of the United States. And I got to tell you, it's a fucking riot when you think about it. The idea is, they've been robbing us for decades, and then an unbelievable moment. It's not Patrick. Patrick plays Ronald Reagan. But there's an incredible moment after they rob this bank. They take, I don't even know how many tens of thousands, if not into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and scare the shit out of everybody on the floor. We'll be out of here in a minute. The usual stuff. We see this in every one of these heist movies, whether it's The Dark Knight or whether it's Heat. You always see this, just go on the floor. You'll be okay. We're not going to here to kill you. We're not, our issue isn't with you. It's with whatever it is. But they rob this bank, and the guy who was playing, the actor who's playing Richard Nixon goes, "I am not a crook." And I was fucking screaming. Even at age 17, I thought that was one of the funniest lines I'd ever seen up to that point in my life. I am not a crook, Richard Nixon. Great. But the world of this film in Point Break, and this is the movie where Keanu Reeves, we all know, has had an incredible career. And the amazing thing with Keanu, he's not much of an actor. He has incredible charisma and an incredible ability to connect with his co-stars, but also with the audience, without being a great thespian. You could say the same about people like Clint Eastwood or Harrison Ford. There are certain stars who have a charisma that is very difficult to pin down and explain. Because Jack Nicholson has charisma, but it's much more easy to discern than Keanu. But Keanu Reeves is a guy that each generation has claimed or continues to claim as their own. Young boomers, when they think of Keanu, they think of Point Break, because young boomers were still in their 20s when this movie came out, and they saw it in theaters 33 years ago, and they're like, hey, I saw this kid in River's Edge, and I thought he was a riot in Parenthood. He was funny with William Hurt and Kevin Kline and I Love You to Death, and wow, this guy is great. Gen Xers, same thing. What the first thing I think of, though, is Neo in The Matrix. I don't think of John Wick, but Gen Z and young millennials, they see Keanu and they claim him, that's John Wick. And it's really, he's had this extraordinary career. He's done so many terrific films, made a lot of bombs, but almost everybody this side of Tom Cruise has made their share of really lousy movies. But this is one of those films where the nominal star is not the most compelling character. And as an older person revisiting Point Break, the reason for the robberies, and doesn't excuse Swayze's horrible behavior, but there is at least a process. They're not just robbing banks to make money, quote unquote. They have an idea, they have a plan, and it's many, many years later, in 2016, Chris Pine made this movie with Jeff Bridges, among others, called Hell or High Water. And Hell or High Water appears to be a conventional bank robbery movie, but it is not a conventional bank robbery movie. And even though Chris Pine and his partner, I don't remember the name of the actor, he's a terrific young actor. He was in Get Over It with Kirsten Dunst. Like, he's been around. Ben Foster. See that? Eventually the synapses connect, even with 300 ideas colliding in my head at the same time. So in Hell or High Water, there are moments where Chris Pine and Ben Foster have to do really horrible things, but they are not simply robbing banks so that they can enrich themselves. They are, spoiler alert, robbing banks because their family lineage, they have been dead broke and in debt to banks for decades. And they have a plan to start building some generational wealth, not for themselves, but for their kids and their nieces and nephews who are born fucked by a system that continues to fuck them over and over and over, and they want to even the score just a little bit. So it doesn't excuse crimes, it doesn't excuse murder, but you at least understand they're relatable bad guys. Well, in the case of Chris Pine's character, he does have a conscience. He's not looking to get anybody hurt. But sometimes shit happens. And in a world of Point Break, the character of Bodhi, that's Patrick Swayze's character, he is super charismatic. But then again, so is Patrick Swayze. So it's hard to kind of, where does the character end and the actor's natural charisma and talent, and the fact that at the time, he was only a couple of notches off being the biggest male leading man in Hollywood. That is how big Patrick Swayze got as a result of Ghost. I mean, he was in the stratosphere, like completely unbelievable. But the nominal plot here, Keanu is playing slightly younger. I think he was, this is ridiculous, he was 26 and he's playing slightly younger. He plays the unlikely named Johnny Utah. Now, I often joke about things being great names or bad names. That's not a good name. That is a stupid name, if you ask me. And Roger Ebert, oddly enough, for how much he loved the movie, he had a rule, a kind of comical guideline that he called Roger Ebert's Law of Funny Names. He used to say, if a character in a movie has a funny name, it's typically a sign of desperation from the filmmakers, that they know they're in trouble and maybe we can get a laugh with the character's name. Richard Donner's The Toy, starring Richard Pryor, the kid's name is Bates, the son, and he's a son of a multimillionaire, so he becomes Master Bates. And the only reason why the main character's name is U.S. Bates is so there can be one gag where the kid's name is Master Bates and Richard Pryor can start laughing. So that's more or less what Roger Ebert was talking about. But Keanu plays Johnny Utah, an FBI agent who literally learns to surf so he can hang out with what the FBI thinks is this gang of bank robbers who are surfers. And what the fuck are they doing robbing banks? None of this makes any sense. And Gary Busey, who I met a number of years ago, plays a fellow FBI agent to Keanu. And the movie is really beautifully shot. And the choreography of the surfing sequences, there's mountain climbing, which is exceedingly well done. There's a fantastic foot chase, which is, it's one of the best foot chases I've ever seen, where Keanu chases one of the former presidents is it after a robbery? It had to be after a robbery, but it's a chase sequence which is exceedingly well orchestrated and shot by Catherine Bigelow, who later, she did The Hurt Locker many years later and got all kinds of acclaim. I think she won Best Director for The Hurt Locker, if I'm not mistaken. She's had kind of an up and down career. She did the terrific vampire film Near Dark, the kind of anti-The Lost Boys, same year, vampire, kind of a dirty, almost independent style vampire movie. And she did Strange Days with Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Lewis and Angela Bassett, and that had a lot of defenders. But I remember one of the professors at NYU who was a huge Catherine Bigelow fan already. She loved Point Break. She loved Near Dark. She saw Strange Days and she came into class and she called Catherine Bigelow a hack. She said, what a hack. I can't believe she made this movie. What a hack. She kept using the word hack. Great word, hack. But Keanu learns to surf and he meets Bodhi, and Swayze's character is very intelligent. You know, don't let the West Coast vibes fool you. He is clearly a very high IQ individual, and he already knows there's something up with this kid. And he actually recognizes him because Johnny Utah was a college football star who kind of, I guess he blew out his knee and he wasn't able to, I mean, who knows if he could go pro, but he wasn't even able to have the opportunity to go pro. And Keanu did the movie many years later in 2000 with, I think, Gene Hackman, called The Replacements. And he played a guy, was it Falco? It wasn't Falco. Whatever the guy, I think it was something like that. But you could kind of argue that he was almost playing the character from Point Break because he was a former college star who then had a chance to play in the pros because of a player strike. So they went with replacement players. An actress who looked like she was going to have a huge career is Keanu's leading lady in this, Lori Petty. Lori Petty springboarded from Point Break right into A League of Their Own with Gina Davis and Tom Hanks, among others. Madonna and Rosie O'Donnell were in that movie. And Lori Petty's career she didn't go anywhere. She did a film in the mid-90s called Tank Girl, which was atrociously bad, and that pretty much sank whatever chance she may have had to be an A-list talent. But she is really good in Point Break because she comes across like a real person. She comes across like a real person looking for something in her life other than just surfing. And her character for me, grounds the film. That she is not coming across as somebody with her head in the clouds or who is involved in any way in Patrick Swayze's sort of dirty dealings and what he's up to. And she doesn't want any part of that. But at the same time, Keanu more or less is full of shit because he doesn't tell her who he really is, because he is working. He is technically undercover. And if he starts to hook up with this woman, he can't say, well, by the way, I'm looking to bust your ex-boyfriend here. He seems to be okay with you and I having, I mean, he doesn't say all that, but that's the implication. And Keanu's character is in a quandary because he does understand what Bodhi is trying to do. And he may even identify, and it's a little bit 4 years later in Heat, to much greater stakes and a much more serious film, where Al Pacino knows that he and Mr. De Niro, that their characters are more alike than different. And if we rebooted The Matrix, those guys probably would have been pals because they had so much in common. But sometimes it's just a question of, you're a cop and your job is to stop this guy who is a criminal. And another movie, a little bit before Point Break, a couple of years earlier, called Tequila Sunrise, has a similar format and a similar concept, but more direct in the sense that Kurt Russell plays an FBI agent named Nick Freesia. And his best friend, his childhood best friend, Dale McCusick, played a very strong performance from Mel Gibson. You know that a movie is fucked up when the nicest person in the primary cast is a drug dealer. And Tequila Sunrise, and it's such a cockeyed thing to do in a film, Mel Gibson's character is the only person who has any humanity, more or less, in the entire story, and he's the drug dealer. But the idea there is Kurt Russell knows his friend is a drug dealer, and he doesn't want to throw him in jail. He wants him to just stop doing what he's doing so that he doesn't have to prosecute his best friend. And he even says, if I'm supposed to do my job here, I have to bust my best friend, and I fucking hate that. Well, in the world of Point Break, Keanu and Patrick, they don't reach the level of best friends, but they do seem like friends. And you know that Keanu is not going to become a bank robber, but there is that moment in the movie where he could take a shot at him if he wanted to, and he chooses not to. And we don't know, is he angry at himself or is he just angry at the situation? Patrick is so good playing bad because he is not pure evil. He is a guy who thinks he's making a point and goes about it a way that, well, I don't know about this. You know, you're willing to go to prison for your beliefs. I can respect that. Just don't hurt people that don't have it coming. And then you're into completely different territory. The film succeeds in what it tries to do, which is keep you on the edge of your seat and give you different looks. If it were just a movie about people robbing banks or cool-looking dudes hanging 10, it might be entertaining. But it's the fact that we get so many different visuals in this film, whether it's mountain climbing, whether it's skydiving, whether it's surfing. Bigelow does not give us the same types of shots repeatedly. She tries to keep it fresh, and it's to her credit that she's able to sustain interest in what could have been a story where we might mentally check out pretty early on if we're not with it. And I just remember after seeing it, I agreed wholeheartedly with Roger Ebert's review. This is a really entertaining film in every way, from the performances to the story to the kind of conflicts the main character faces and the supporting characters, and you know what's going to happen to Gary Busey's character and all of that. And I love it. I know they did a remake about 10 years ago. It's not good. I'm not one of those purists. I might be a purist, but I'm not the sort of purist who automatically assumes that a remake or a long gestating sequel is going to suck. I thought that maybe there was a chance they could do something interesting with a new Point Break. No, didn't work. No good. They couldn't recapture the magic because it was a product of its time. Point Break was it screams early 90s. It screams early 90s. It doesn't even feel like 80s anymore. It screams early 90s. And you could say the same about Home Alone, which was conceived in the late 80s, but Home Alone feels very much like 90s, even though it came out in 1990. But Point Break is available for streaming. I think it's on Paramount Plus, but it had been on AMC. It was on Tubi. I know that it's been free with Amazon Prime and Pluto. And you could find it. If you've never seen it, I don't like spending anybody's money, even just a couple of bucks. It's not mine to spend. But I will say that if you are a Keanu Reeves fan, especially, and you don't know that much, maybe you're under 30 and you're not that familiar with Patrick Swayze, he has been gone 15 years, and his kind of glory days are now more than 3 decades ago. But Patrick Swayze is one of those special people, and it is such a tragedy that he died so young, that it was pancreatic cancer that took him. He was somebody who lived holistically. He took impeccable care of his body with yoga and meditation, and he worked out every day and ate macrobiotic for, like, he was doing avocado toast before it was in vogue. Well, so was Clint Eastwood for that matter. But Patrick Swayze was someone who was so health conscious, and to die of such a terrible cancer still hurts for Gen Xers like me who, you know, grew up watching the guy and being fans. Point Break, though, 33 years old, and it's only an unlikely big box office hit because of Terminator 2 and Robin Hood and Naked Gun 2.5 and the other big studio releases. Because of Patrick Swayze, who was flying so high, that's why it hit, especially overseas, because this film made more than $40 million overseas, and even that, you would say, this is a very American movie. This is not a film that you necessarily would think would be big overseas, whereas Terminator 2, they were pretty sure, oh, we're going to dub this and we're going to make a killing in Italy and England and France and wherever we take this movie. But Point Break did way better overseas than expected. And like I said, if you haven't seen it, it is a must-see. If for nothing else but to understand how Keanu, this is his first big leading role in an action movie, which, as we know, he has become something of a master of it. But he holds the camera well, and he has really good chemistry with Swayze and with Lori Petty, for that matter. They would make a terrific couple. But it's hard to believe, because I remember seeing the ads on TV for this movie. It's hard to believe I was only 17 at that time. But it's true. Time does its number on us all. Point Break, directed by Catherine Bigelow and starring Keanu Reeves, Patrick Swayze, Gary Busey, and Lori Petty. Released on this day 33 years ago. This has been episode 244 of the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Thursday afternoon with me here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platform such as Podbean, which is now hosting the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast, or Spotify or iTunes or Amazon Music or any of those platforms, click like, subscribe, share, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.